Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Volume 124 of the West Virginia Law Review Symposium, Health and Understanding the Impact of Healthcare Law in Rural Communities. My name is Jared Phelan, and we are excited that you are joining us this morning. Before we begin, we would like to briefly thank everyone who has helped make this symposium possible. There are obviously too many of you to name, but please know that your contributions are highly appreciated. Specifically, we would like to extend a thank you to Professor Valerie Blake for putting us in contact with many of the wonderful presenters we will hear today and tomorrow. To the presenters, thank you for taking time out of your schedules to not only write great articles for the third issue of the Law Review, but also for visiting us here in Morgantown. Additionally, we would like to thank Lisa Brignoli, without whom it would have been nearly impossible to arrange for hotels, transportation, food, and many other aspects of the symposium. Finally, to all of our Law Review members who have already assisted or will assist with driving, speaking, and all other facets of the event, thank you, and we really appreciate your attendance. So when deciding a topic for this year's symposium, we wanted something that was both timely and affects so many people each day. We also wanted our symposium to cover topics that hit close to home. As the only law school in West Virginia, we wanted our topic to relate to the people of our state. Thus, with these goals in mind, we decided to host a symposium on healthcare law in rural areas. So over the next 2 days, we will discuss various topics related to the problems currently facing rural areas with regards to healthcare access, the important role that healthcare plays in rural communities, international solutions that could help the current rural healthcare crisis, and the current struggle for financial stability that rural healthcare facilities face every day. We are excited to learn from each of our presenters, and we look forward to spending the next couple of days with them. And with that being said, I'll let Jalen introduce our first speaker.
Good morning, everybody. I want to echo Jared's welcome and thank all of you for being here. We're so excited to see so many people in the room. Our first speaker is Professor Rna Hacksgaard. Professor Hacksgaard is an associate professor at the University of South Dakota Knudsen School of Law, where her scholarship focuses on rurality and law. Today, Professor Hacksgaard will present her paper on frontier nursing and rural midwives. So please give her a
All right, is this mic good? Okay. Thank you to Jalen and Jared and the rest of the members of the West Virginia Law Review for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here and have the chance to talk about this topic. So, as you can see, I'm talking about frontier nursing and rural midwifery. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about Frontier Nursing University and its recent move out of Appalachia to central Kentucky. Frontier Nursing University is an organization that came about through Frontier Nursing Service, and also called FNS for Frontier Nursing Service, that was located for almost a century in Leslie County, Kentucky. And again, it recently moved out of Appalachia, which sort of prompted this paper and talk. First, I want to start by sort of talking about the geography of the place, because I think when talking about Appalachia, geography matters. So here is map of Kentucky with Leslie County highlighted. Leslie County has 400 square miles of dense Appalachian foothills in southeastern Kentucky. The population is about 10,000, and that's been relatively stable over the years. Leslie County is 98% white, and it is considered the most Republican county in Kentucky. Over its history, it has never once been voted for a Democratic presidential nominee. During the Civil War, Leslie County residents generally fought for and sympathized with the Union, which started their relationship with the Republican Party. That relationship has, of course, continued. So, for example, Richard Nixon made his first public appearance following Watergate in Leslie County to dedicate a new recreation center. Recently, Donald Trump got 90% of the vote in Leslie County. So, beyond all of those things, Leslie County also happens to be the home of my maternal ancestors. My mother was born in Leslie County and lived there until her late 20s. Her parents were both lifelong residents of Leslie County, as were their parents. I grew up visiting Leslie County. Here's a couple of photos of me as a kid in the mountains. And I would go there for multiple weeks each year. We spent quite a bit of time in Leslie County. So perhaps a bit like J.D. Vance, I claim Appalachia as part of my heritage. I would say, unlike J.D. Vance, though, I'm a generation closer to Appalachia than he is, and I will also freely acknowledge that I'm an outsider. By the time I was born, my parents had moved to central Kentucky. I actually grew up in South Dakota, and then when I returned to Kentucky for undergraduate, I went to Lexington, which is, of course, not in Appalachia at all, but rather is in the central part of the state. So in other words, I'm talking today about a place that I love, but a place that I've never lived. So a little more about Leslie County. It is solidly coal country. The economy of Leslie County has fallen and risen with coal. My own family was brought out of generational poverty through coal. So here is my grandfather in some of his coal mining gear. He was the type of guy who took dangerous jobs in the mines for hazard pay. He had 5 kids, and his priority was providing them a good life and getting them an education. The other photo is him on his property near the end of his life. So my grandparents, like Leslie County residents for generations before, also farmed for their daily food. So this 2012 photo is my grandma and my aunt on the family property in Leslie County. And this land, sort of flat pieces, or as flat as you can get carved into the hillside, is what grew the family sort of daily food for many years. And I want to show this picture and sort of backtrack and say that, well, before coal came to Leslie County was poor, and there was a lot of subsistent farming on sort of the flat pieces of land that people could find near where they lived. So the story I'm telling today starts before coal came to Leslie County. It starts before there were roads in Leslie County. It's about Leslie County starting in the 1920s. And it's the story of an elite white woman coming into Appalachia to try to help the locals. And the woman we're talking about today is Mary Breckenridge. Pictured here kind of later in her life in Leslie County. But Mary Breckenridge was originally from an elite political family. Her grandfather had been the vice president to James Buchanan, and then he later served as a brigadier general in the Confederate Army, and after that as the Confederate Secretary of War. Mary Breckenridge's father started as a Confederate foot soldier as a teenager, and then he went on to serve in some very important governmental posts, including as the ambassador to Russia, and then had jobs sort of running other governmental agencies. Without a doubt, had Mary Breckenridge been a man, she would have had an elite education and held important jobs based on the trajectory of her family. However, of course, she was a woman. She ended up marrying in her early 20s, as she was supposed to do. She was widowed from her first husband in her early 20s without any children. She then married again and had 2 kids. Tragically, she lost both of those children early in life. She had a premature newborn daughter who lived for only a couple of hours, and then a couple years after losing that daughter, she lost a 4-year-old son to a sudden illness. After the children died, Mary Breckenridge divorced her second husband. She became a nurse. This was immediately following World War I. She went to France to provide nursing care in war-torn France. And then after that, she decided to dedicate the rest of her life to serving mothers and children in America. And in particular, she wanted to focus on childbirth and really early infant care. So she went back to Europe to obtain a midwifery degree in Britain, which was really the place where you could become a nurse midwife through formal education. And then she set up the Frontier Nursing Service in Leslie County. And 1925, she chooses Leslie County as her home base and starts this process. So I'm going to talk through some of the history of Frontier Nursing Service from 1925 today using a timeline as we go along here. So the Frontier Nursing Service, which was formed in 1925, starts out as midwifery service, right? So it's really focused on delivering babies in Leslie County. They also, though, immediately began providing prenatal and postnatal care to the women who use their services. Quickly, though, they realized that services needed to expand to immunizations and other health care, and so that happens pretty quickly. The other thing that happens is they slowly start opening outpost nursing centers sort of scattered around the country or around the county so that it's easier for the nurses to make home visits. So here is kind of a classic picture of a Frontier Nursing Service nurse out on a home visit. Because even though they had clinics, most of their care was provided with the nurses traveling to homes. Mary Breckenridge was very particular in choosing Leslie County. It was not a mistake that she chose somewhere sort of deep in Appalachia. Like much of Appalachia, Leslie County had been left behind by the reformers of the Progressive era, who focused more on the urban poor rather than the rural poor. And at the time, Leslie County was desperately poor. So again, before coal, the families in the area were subsistence farmers on the little flat pieces of land they could find near the creek beds. Industry had not yet come to Leslie County. There was no railroad coming through the county. There were no roads. You had to travel about 27 miles to get to the closest rail station if you wanted to leave the mountains. Instead of roads, people largely traveled in creek beds. Either on horse or on mule was the mode of transportation. So Mary Breckenridge wanted a place like this that was rural and was poor. She also wanted it to be inaccessible, which of course Leslie County was because of the Appalachian Mountains. She found all of that in Leslie County. She also found a population that was largely Anglo-Saxon. There had been very little migration into Leslie County for a few generations, and most of the people living there were descendants of early Irish and sort of English settlers who had come to the United States with some French ancestry mixed in as well. So the nurses that she brought in were trained midwives, and they famously traveled around on horseback. Here's a photo from Life magazine in 1937 of a frontier nurse. And without roads, they were largely relying on home visits, and they moved through the mountain, of course, with very few supplies, keeping most of their nursing supplies in the saddlebags. So one of the sort of fun cultural things about Leslie County is kids grew up, instead of thinking of storks delivering babies, they thought of babies arriving in the saddlebags of the frontier nursing nurses who came around. So this is a 1937 photo, again, from Life magazine, which is posed, right? But it's sort of it's a fun little thing about Leslie County. So the nurses, their work was rural and their work was remote. They do lots of home visits. The deliveries taking place are happening in mountain cabins. Mary Breckenridge originally thought of Frontier Nursing Service as a demonstration project, and she wanted to see it replicated across the country, particularly in other mountainous regions like we see in Leslie County. For the first several decades, it was funded through donations from sort of urban elites across America. And although she really wanted to open similar sites in other places, that never happened because the Depression hit and her fundraising goals started falling short. But one thing she was able to fundraise and get done before the Depression was the building of a hospital in 1928. So 1928, she builds a hospital in the town of Hyden. Hyden was the county seat of Leslie County. It's not much of a town to speak of because it's just sort of a more populated sort of density of people. It's only got about 300 residents, but it's got all of the county offices and all of that stuff. So 1928, they get a hospital. Here's a photo of the hospital with some nurses in later years where you can see cars have come, because in 1928 when the hospital's built, there's still not roads into Leslie County, so we're still relying on horse travel. So once the hospital arrives, that means that more nurses are hired and brought in, and we're providing more health care than just midwifery services. It also means that there's a physician on staff at the hospital who's overseeing everything. Mary Breckenridge during this time period was very busy fundraising. She's spending a lot of time getting press coverage of Frontier Nursing Service, and Frontier Nursing Service becomes really well known throughout the United States because she's pushing it so much in the press. So I've shown a couple of the images from the Life magazine article in 1937, but here's just one of the pages of the spreads that they did. Just an example of the many types of press coverage there was. There were also silent films and other ways that the project was promoted. So despite the hospital being in existence and being in Hayden, most medical care was still provided by the nurse midwives at this time and not by physicians. This was a new and different model of healthcare, of having trained nurse midwives be the primary care providers. Because of the rural and remote nature of Leslie County, there was not much fight between the nurses and physicians because, quite frankly, physicians did not want to go to Leslie County. So they were not battling against physician organizations because they could not get any physicians to last long in Leslie County, which means that the nurses had more autonomy in the way they cared for patients. So these nurse midwives were operating almost autonomously. They would go out and deliver babies and provide other health care. So while supervised by the medical director, of course they're on their own during these at-home deliveries. But there are benefits to having the hospital nearby. The Life magazine included this series of photos that I love, which is a mom who's being carried to the hospital. So if you can see, they've got her on a stretcher, and then they take her across the Middle Fork River. What I love is on the top one, on the sort of, you can see the nurse on the top right corner carrying the baby behind, right, on the transport to the hospital. And of course, this was the benefit of having the hospital in Hayden, is that there was now a backup physician. If things got wrong or things became complicated, there was a place to take people who were having medical emergencies. And it wasn't just mothers, right? It was gunshot victims, it was burn victims. There was a number of people, of course, who just get general health care in Leslie County beyond childbirth. I do think it's worth noting that we're now almost 100 years later from Mary Breckenridge starting this program, and we're still working on utilizing mid-level providers. So physicians' assistants, nurse practitioners, nurse midwives are still fighting sort of battles to really be integrated into the healthcare system, and it's clear that we could use them better. And in that way, Mary Breckenridge was ahead of her time. She also was ahead of her time in how much provided both prenatal and postnatal care. So just a couple of photos of examples of home visits by Frontier Nursing Service nurses. So the actual provision of health care, like we've seen so far, was part of her goal. But another part of her goal was to educate future nurse midwives. So Mary Breckenridge had always hoped to open a nurse midwifery school, and that happens in 1939. She opens a school and gets her first round of graduates. In 1939, when the Frontier Nursing School started, there was only one other midwifery school in the United States, and that was in New York City. Up until then, most of the Frontier Nursing midwives had been trained in Britain, and then there were actually British midwives that came back with a few Americans who had gone for training and come back home. But with World War II on the horizon, Frontier Nursing and Mary Breckenridge really had no option but to start training their own midwives because their nurses were heading home to provide health care during the war. And of course, it became untenable to send Americans to Britain for training with the outbreak of World War II. So the school is formed. It promotes itself as for rural and remote students. And I will say this, is despite her otherwise clear dedication to the people of Leslie County, one failing of Mary Breckenridge is that she did not provide educational opportunities for the people of Leslie County to come and get educated at her school. Most of the students tended to be wealthier, they tended to be middle class, and come from sort of areas outside of Appalachia. Some ended up staying in Leslie County to work for Frontier Nursing Service. Many went on to other rural locations, including a lot who worked overseas in rural in missions, doing midwifery work sort of around the globe. So in 1965, Mary Breckenridge died. This certainly was the end of an era for both frontier nursing and for Leslie County. But the organization was able to continue on after her death. There's this really nice bronze statue in Hayden today that honors Mary Breckenridge. But it has continued on, right? So the school continued to train nurse midwives. Services continued to be provided through the frontier nurses and the hospital staff. But times were changing in healthcare. Medicare meant that frontier nursing service started taking federal dollars rather than relying on private donations. Technology was also changing in Leslie County. So by this time, instead of horses, the frontier nursing service staff were largely driving Jeeps, sometimes on road and sometimes still through creek beds. My mother grew up idolizing the Jeep driving nurses and wanted to become sort of one of these women who drove around in Jeeps providing health care. And with roads throughout the county, everything was becoming more accessible all the time. Running water and electricity became common in homes. Quite frankly, coal had raised the standard of living because there now was an influx of money. So 1975, using a lot of federal dollars, Frontier Nursing Service built a larger hospital to replace the original 1928 hospital. So the original hospital had 12 beds. The modern one goes up to a 40-bed hospital, pictured here, which is still in existence today and operating in Leslie County. By this time, the school had also expanded, so it was doing more than just nurse midwifery education. It was also training nurse practitioners in family medicine and was on the forefront of nurse practitioner training. So just a few years later, after this hospital was built, in 1979, my mom became the first Leslie County native to graduate from the Frontier Nursing School, which is, of course, a cool moment in their history, and they put my mom on the front cover of their quarterly bulletin. So she is the very young-looking nurse in the white coat over there, and then on the inside, they had a picture of my mom with her parents on the inside cover, acknowledging that she was the first Leslie County resident to make it through the program. So my mom decided to stay in Leslie County. She worked at the Mary Breckenridge Hospital through Frontier Nursing Service. She was a nurse midwife and a nurse practitioner who did sort of general family care. And a few years after that, my dad, who was at that time a brand new doctor from South Dakota, took a temporary job at the emergency room at the Mary Breckenridge Hospital, and as they might say, the rest is history. So my parents ultimately left Leslie County, but of course Frontier Nursing stayed. And in 1989, there's a huge change because the school goes to distance education. The birth rates had dramatically declined in Leslie County after birth control becomes widely available. Plus, with the rise in insurance, more women could afford to drive to Hazard to have their hospital or have their babies in hospitals attended by physicians rather than by the nurse midwives in Hayden. There simply were not enough babies being born in Leslie County to give students the clinical experience that they needed to become trained nurse midwives to go out then to other areas. So by going to distance education, the school allowed students to stay in their home counties, get a lot of experience. But what the school continued to do was bring students to Leslie County for intensive training periods. They would show up for several weeks at a time, and while they were there, they would, of course, learn about rural healthcare. And there were many students from rural areas, and Leslie County likely felt familiar to those students. So their program only grew after it went to the distance education model. That proved really popular and it proved successful, and things were good and going well. In 2011, Frontier Nursing sold their hospital to a regional healthcare provider. So the Mary Breckenridge Hospital passed from Frontier Nursing into the hands of Appalachian Regional Healthcare, which still runs the hospital today. So now that means Frontier Nursing is out of the direct provision of services and instead is focused on its educational component. And that brings me to 2020, when Frontier Nursing University leaves Leslie County. So this abandonment of Leslie County is what prompted this paper and prompted sort of the discussion today. And it's what I want to reflect on. And I feel like I need to give the history, right? It's like, well, why do I care so much about the move? Well, I care because there is almost a 100-year history of the school being in Leslie County. So the move was announced in 2017. By the time 2017 rolls around, the school is now called Frontier Nursing University, and it offered a wide range of nursing degrees, including nurse midwifery was still one of the program options, but there's a lot of other advanced nursing degrees that are offered. It's a well-established school, its alumni are practicing all over the world, and it's well-regarded. But despite its long history in Leslie County and its long success in operating out of Leslie County, it announced that it was leaving Appalachia and going to central Kentucky to the suburban community of Versailles. So Versailles is kind of in the central part of the state. It is certainly not Appalachian. It is bluegrass country, and Versailles is a town of 10,000, which is not particularly big, but the thing is, it's right next to Lexington. And Lexington, of course, is Kentucky's second largest city. Versailles at this point is basically a suburb of Lexington. While they have some of their own services, in large ways it's become a bedroom community of people who commute into Lexington to work. So Frontier Nursing continues to claim that they are a rural county, but they're really not in a rural county. There's certainly horse farms around the location of the school, but Versailles is neither rural nor remote in the way that we think of those terms or in the way that Mary Breckenridge would have thought of those terms. In fact, Frontier Nursing, one of the big things they've publicized since the move is their proximity to Lexington's airport and how they're only 10 minutes from the Bluegrass Airport, which should be a driver to get people there. Because of the pandemic, Frontier Nursing hasn't actually had students on this campus yet, but they have relocated all of their staff, and they are gone from Leslie County. The school explained this move for a few reasons. So first, they say that because the campus is next to the Lexington airport, that it's easier for students to get to the school for these intensive training weeks. And second, they say that they can accommodate more students on their new campus. So I, of course, cannot argue with sort of the factual truth of these points, right? But I can be disappointed in the move nonetheless, and I can think that there weren't enough benefits to this move to justify leaving Appalachia and leaving Leslie County where they had been for a long time. So when I think about the harms of this move, two things come to mind for me. First, that this was a huge hit to Leslie County. So I've heard through my mother and from other relatives who still live in Leslie County how difficult this is and how disappointing it has been for locals. So there's an emotional disappointment because the institution was really important to the county. They celebrate Mary Breckenridge Days, right? She's a big figure in the community, and Frontier Nursing Service has been a long part of their identity. But there's also a practical disappointment because of the harms that this has done to Leslie County. So throughout its history, Frontier Nursing has provided jobs and stimulated the economy in Leslie County. There are some sort of sad news articles after it announced its departure with the owner of the one cafe in town talking about the hits to his business without having students cycle through to campus and spending money in Hayden. There were 30 employees in Hayden in 2017 when they announced the move. So of course that means 30 jobs gone from an otherwise impoverished area. Frontier Nursing Service put Leslie County on the map in a national sense, and it provided solid healthcare options at low cost to generations of people in Leslie County. It also provided professional options to people like my mother who grew up with few professional role models outside of coal mining. It was a bad move for Leslie County, a place that Mary Breckenridge loved, and one can only assume that she'd be sorely disappointed in the institution's decision to leave Leslie County, which is a place that she viewed as important, and she was happy to provide services in. My second sort of concern with the move is I think it's a bad move for the training of rural nurse midwives and rural healthcare practitioners in general. Mary Breckenridge loved to tout the statistic that more American women had given their lives in childbirth than American men had given their lives in war. She viewed childbirth as women's battlefield, and this was a compelling argument to convince America's elite to donate money to her in the early years of this program. Yet almost 100 years after Mary Breckenridge set up in Leslie County, childbirth remains dangerous. Many rural communities in particular face maternity care deserts. Small hospitals are closing. Even rural hospitals that have stayed open have seen the closure of their maternity wards, in part because of a shortage of providers, in part because insurance costs are prohibitive. Rural women end up driving excessive distances to access prenatal care and childbirth health care, and that ends up being really bad for mothers and babies, unsurprisingly. So in rural areas, like throughout maternity care as a whole, there's also data that supports the women facing the worst outcomes are poor women, and especially poor women of color. It is clear that the country needs to do something to improve maternal health care. One solution is to train more nurse midwives who would fill these healthcare deserts in rural areas. But of course, to train more nurse midwives, there need to be schools that can attract rural students and train students to practice in rural areas. So having a rural-based school in Leslie County was one way to attract and train rural students. It was also a way to expose other students to rural midwifery practice and hopefully entice them to choose rural practice upon graduation. So frontier nursing today promises that rural students are still welcome and that the school will teach rural practice, but this is an area where I would say that actions speak louder than words. There are no other rural Appalachian midwifery schools. Frontier nursing used to offer something unique, but that uniqueness and its long history has gone with the move to Versailles. Frontier nursing claims that the move was necessary to make travel easier for students, but I question that because what about students from Appalachia who would prefer to stay in their region for their education? And what about students from rural communities who would rather learn in a rural community where they feel comfortable? Those students are forgotten in the discussions of the benefit of a move to this more urban place. As institutions of higher learning move from rural to urban locations, it's worth asking who wins and who loses. The clear winner are the institutions who have a larger labor pool and can situate themselves in suburban comforts and the ease of access to other services. The losers, though, are the rural communities who are abandoned. So it's the workers who lost jobs. It's the students who cannot afford to travel to urban locations for their higher education. It's young children without professional role models in their communities when these institutions leave. It's the local businesses who lose the influx of outside money. And it's the local population who lose access to services that would otherwise be provided by the school. I will say this is frontier nursing is not the only institution of higher learning who has thought about or finished a move from a rural to an urban location. A few years ago, my own institution, the University of South Dakota Knudson School of Law, considered moving from a college town of 10,000 to the state's largest city. Thankfully, that did not happen. But similar moves have happened with other law schools across the country. For example, in 2007, Campbell University in North Carolina went through with a similar proposal where they moved their law school from a rural community to downtown Raleigh. Both law schools and midwifery schools are disproportionately urban, and I would say that this is not ideal for our underserved rural populations. It disadvantages rural students, but it also communicates that urban is better. If institutions think they cannot teach a skill in a rural area, I would ask why rural students would think that they could enter that profession. And I would ask why current students would envision a future in a rural place if the school cannot exist in a rural place. Abandoning rural communities signals that rural places are not worthwhile, and it's not worth continuing to invest in those places. So putting it all in perspective it's clear that I am critical of Frontier Nursing Services' move. The main critique relates to leaving behind Leslie County and abandoning a history of rural healthcare provision and rural healthcare education. But I want to end on what I think is perhaps an even sadder note for Leslie County, which is that Mary Breckenridge, during her lifetime, inherited a 15th century stained glass window of St. Christopher. Sort of, you can see the outside of it on the chapel there, and then of course from the inside over here. She dreamed of building a chapel near the Hayden Hospital, and this is a feat that she accomplished by fundraising from the people of Leslie County. So in 1960, she saw the chapel built, and she donated her prized stained glass window to the Frontier Nursing Chapel. Every year, she would tell the story of St. Christopher, which she saw as particularly important to rural mountain people. After Frontier Nursing left Leslie County, the local community called for Frontier Nursing to leave the stained glass window, which they saw as a significant piece of local history. So although Frontier Nursing did end up donating their old campus to Leslie County and Mary Breckenridge's old home to Leslie County, they decided to take the stained glass, and they did so under cover of darkness and carried it away to their campus in Versailles. This was one of those things that added insult to injury for the people of Leslie County, and I think that it sort of speaks to an indication of the lack of appreciation for Leslie County's people. So at the end of the day, I would say this, is I will always admire and appreciate Frontier Nursing, especially for what it provided to my own mother and to my family's community. But it is hard to see such an important institution pick up and leave a place that I love. It's also hard to generally see the urbanization of healthcare education at a time when rural places are in desperate need of rural healthcare providers. The country's first practicing nurse midwives were in Appalachia, and that's a history that it's hard to see pulled away from the region. So I will end there, and I think we have plenty of time for Q&A. Awesome.
All right, do we have any questions?
First, thank you for coming to speak today. And then my question relates to, do you think that Mary Breckenridge's model of Frontier Services is compatible with today's modern healthcare services and how we offer healthcare services, or if we need to see a shift to properly extend healthcare to rural communities?
Yeah, so I would say that her original model would be entirely non-functional under today's healthcare services because she did not take money from the government. So she initially tried to get money from the government, felt like the government was too controlling of the services that she was trying to provide. She had a reputation for being stubborn, and she didn't want government money because that meant the government would try to control what she did. So in the sense that, in that sense, you couldn't replicate this today in any meaningful fashion because it would take too much money, and services like this would have to rely on Medicare and Medicaid for enough funding to function. Now, I do still think there's a really important role for similar programs that take government money to be in rural places, but it would look different because you couldn't rely on private donations anymore.
Other questions?
Thanks for the great talk. So I was, as you were talking, I was thinking about regulatory solutions to the move.
Sure.
So if you think about, if you were talking about a nonprofit hospital, right, the state could intervene and say, we're going to revoke your nonprofit tax status if you change your mission. Obviously, that's not on the table here for this university, but did you think about ways in which the state apparatus could have prevented this kind of move, or suggestions for states in the future to try to prevent this kind of thing from happening?
I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, and part of it is because this is private, right? There's no association between this school and the state, right? Like, it's not a state institution of higher learning. And so, of course, there's less control. And I am not a education expert in the sense of, I don't know how much control the federal government may have been able to exert because, of course, their students are taking out federal loans, right? So there, of course, is some government relation, but I don't know enough to know if there would be a way for the government to exert that power against a private educational institute.
Other questions?
Thank you for your talk. I had a question just with the urbanization of medicine. What about people from rural areas who want to be midwives if they go away to one of these urban schools but then want to come back? Maybe how training in an urban area would make it more difficult to come back to the rural areas where they came from or other rural areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big thing I would say is because we don't have enough physicians in rural areas. Like, we have a shortage of physicians, and that shortage is acute in rural areas, and there's a lot of places with especially no OBGYNs, is that if you're going to be a practicing nurse midwife in a rural area, you're more likely to be the only person who's dealing with the deliveries. If you're a nurse midwife in an urban place, there's always a physician in the hospital to take over. So I do think that when Frontier Nursing University says, well, we're going to continue to train people for rural services, I think what they mean is we're training people to be able to carry through with the whole provision of care without a backup physician, whereas education for nurse midwives who are going to practice in urban places, you just know that there's a backup option. So I think, you can do that type of training probably anywhere, but I think the cool thing and the reason that Frontier Nursing was so popular in its early days was it was one of the few places you could go and be a midwife without doctors watching over your shoulder. And the literature that talks about early midwifery education talks about Frontier Nursing as being so different than other places because as a midwife there, you are on your own. So I'd say that that's the big difference, right? At this point, nurse midwives can practice in all 50 states. There's regulations that control them. And of course, they're not supposed to be OBGYNs, but if there's no OBGYN available, these nurse midwives pick up a lot of care that otherwise physicians might do.
Any other questions?
So I kind of have two questions. The first being, you had said that the hospital it's still in operation today.
Yes.
Is there a concern that, because the school has moved out of the area, that the hospital, might lose that funding and might also leave the area?
I don't think so. I think that the hospital, it's like many regional hospitals, it has been cutting the types of services it provides, and more people travel, right, to the larger communities of London or Hazard, right, in the area. But there's no, at this point, threat that the hospital totally shuts down.
And then also, I know that your mother was obviously the first kind of Leslie County graduate. Do you think that the school's kind of early, with Mary Breckenridge not having as many like Leslie County students sort of contributed to maybe this move in the future, in the idea that maybe there weren't as many Leslie County individuals involved in the school?
Yeah, I mean, so since my mom, I know that there have been a few other graduates from Leslie County, but the student population is still predominantly from other areas that come in to get the education and then they go back. The leadership of the school has long been outsiders. And so, of course, maybe a part of it is if you're not training the local rural population in a way that they'll be important in decision making, it's probably easier to leave that area. And there's a lot of criticisms you can make about Mary Breckenridge. She lived in a different time, in a different place. But I think that there is a criticism is that I think that she saw Leslie Countyans as the recipient of her services and not as involved in providing the services. And that was probably a bad take initially, right? And it probably leads to the school ultimately leaving because there's less control among the Leslie Countyans versus among outsiders who have had to move to Hayden because that's where this great institution is. So I think that's a good point.
Once again, thank you so much for being here today. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on like telemedicine. And I mean, I think maybe obviously telemedicine doesn't seem like an adequate substitute for something like midwifery, but just I guess more generally what your thoughts were on if you thought like telemedicine is an effective solution to kind of rural healthcare deserts.
So I'm excited to sit here for the next 2 days and hear what everybody else who speaks says about telemedicine, because I will tell you that my reaction is I actually write a lot more about rural lawyer services than I do about rural medical services, and I just don't think that telemedicine or telecommunication with lawyers is an adequate substitution. And I think there's a few reasons for it, but the one that I would highlight here is the rural communities who have the biggest trouble traveling to access their services are also the rural communities that don't have broadband, and they don't have the access to adequate technology to even fully participate. And certainly I think, as you say, of like, well, you can't deliver a baby remotely, right? So beyond everything else that's just not gonna work. But I would say like, I am relatively hesitant and critical of any call for, let's just do things remote, whether it's with doctors or lawyers or anything else, is because I think you lose something in that process and you leave behind the most vulnerable. And I would think, this is a little bit beyond that question, but Frontier Nursing also went to a poor county for poor people who didn't have resources to pay for better health care. And I think that if we're trying to serve our poorest and most vulnerable populations, many of them don't have computers even, right? And so you have another failure there. So not to sound too pessimistic, right? Because there is certainly a time and a place for it, but it's not a panacea for us.
I have a question real quick, and then I'll open it back up to you guys if you want. So especially when we talk about, you made a point that really hit home with me about how we have these students in rural areas. Why do they think that they're important if the schools are in the urban areas? And I think that's something that many people here can identify with. I'd say a lot of us grew up in rural areas and came to one of the most urban areas in West Virginia for law school. So what are the practical ways that we bring these training institutions, whether they be legal training, medical training, et cetera, back into the rural communities?
I think for me, the biggest thing is to stop moving them. That sounds a little bit silly, right? But it's certainly something that's been happening. And it's something that keeps getting talked about. And the conversation about why do we move, it's easy because there's more internships. There's more opportunities for experiential learning. If you don't have enough lawyers are around or enough babies being born, you can't do the experiential learning in your rural location, which I think is a little bit sad because you certainly can get experiential education, but it looks different, right? Instead of being at a fancy urban law firm or at a big hospital, you're working with like small providers. And so that's one answer is don't fall into the idea that we have to be urban to be a good educational institution. I mean, I think there's also a role for the government or the institutions of higher ed to play in incentivizing students to, say, spend summers for law students out in rural places, to do your internships, for physicians to do your internships and your residencies in rural locations. And of course, the government can fund that, right, by saying, we'll give money for people who hire students, because if we get students to those rural areas, then maybe they're going to stay because they can see that there's opportunities. So I think that even in, West Virginia is very different than South Dakota because here you are in kind of the big city. There's ways to get folks out to rural areas if we promote it, and a lot of it's also messaging. Like on day one when you show up, does the school tell you that there's viable options in rural areas? Because they should be telling you that, because it's a service to both the state and the profession to push students back to rural areas where we know that we need service providers and we know that the people need services, is what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more?
Hi. I think as you mentioned in response to Kate's question, the frontier nursing was, originally comprised of outsiders, the leadership, other than Mary Breckenridge, of course. How do you incentivize outsiders now to come to these rural areas? Because I think you would need the next coming of Mary Breckenridge to really advocate for Leslie County.
Yeah, so I would say Mary Breckenridge was also an outsider. So she had family connections in Kentucky, but they actually, interesting enough, were in Woodford County, which is where Versailles is. So she was not an Appalachian, right? She was a transplant in. So in terms of how do you get people in, I mean, my best solution would be to create pipelines where we take rural students and give them solid education and pull them into higher ed and shepherd them through and then push them out the other end and send them home to viable careers. We know that rural students struggle in higher ed. They struggle in college. They're less likely to graduate, less likely to go on to professional careers. And a large part of that is we think that young kids envision careers of the people that they see. Right? There's a reason my mom wanted to drive a Jeep and deliver babies, which is she saw the educated people in her community driving Jeeps and delivering babies. And so part of it is getting to those rural communities and demonstrating for kids what the options are, right? And I think some places do better at this than others, of are you going out and doing demonstrations of this is what it's like to be a lawyer to the fourth graders? Because you do a presentation and you never know what fourth grader is going to say, hey, that's going to be me. And 20 years later, they're back in their community serving that community, right? So I would say that that's one thing. And I think the government has a role to play. And the government's been better at this in medical incentives than in legal incentives, is doing things like loan forgiveness programs that are targeted at rural areas, is getting physicians to go to rural areas, getting nurses to go to rural areas and saying, we'll forgive your loans. The problem is that those people aren't sticking, right? And so I think there has to be, I hate to be we'll extend the length of the loan forgiveness. I wouldn't say that, but I think if you target people from rural areas, then you incentivize them to go back, they're more likely to stick where their family is versus somebody from Pittsburgh sticking in southern West Virginia, right, who has no connection. So I think for me, I envision the whole pipeline as being a really important aspect of this.
All right, we'll take one more, and then we're going to let Professor Hacksgaard off the hook up here. Do we have any more questions?
All right, well, thank you to everybody for listening. I will say, like, it is fun to talk to people who know something about Appalachia because, of course, I'm in South Dakota and people don't. It's also fun to get to talk about something that's, like, so important to my family, right? So thank you for all those questions and for listening today.
And thank you. That was a lovely speech. We appreciate it very much. We are going to take about a 20-minute break. We're going to reconvene at 11:15. So if you need to use the restroom, get a drink, whatever, we'll be back at 11:15. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So as I pick this up,
Oh, yeah.
is my honor to introduce. Okay. Good morning, everyone. It is my honor to introduce Professors Elizabeth Van Nostrand and Amy Palumbo. Professors Elizabeth Van Nostrand and Amy Palumbo are colleagues at Temple University. Professor Van Nostrand is an associate professor in the Department of Health Services Administration and Policy and also serves as the department's Masters of Public Health Program Director. She is an expert in legal epidemiology. Professor Amy Palumbo is an assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Temple University's College of Public Health. Her scholarship focuses on using principles of epidemiology to understand how social exposures influence health. Today, Professors Van Nostrand and Palumbo will present their research entitled, Why Aren't Mountain Folks Getting the Shot? Health Literacy, COVID-19, and Vaccination Rates in West Virginia Counties. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm Elizabeth Van Nostrand, and although my colleague Amy and I work in one of the most urban places in America, downtown Philadelphia, I actually live in rural Garrett County, Maryland, about 45 minutes east of here, with the other Professor Van Nostrand, who is here. So we would like to thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this very important symposium. And we would really like to thank the Law Review for your patience in correcting all of our typos and citations. So thank you very much. So at the very vaccine distribution, West Virginia was a leader in vaccine uptake. Over time, however, West Virginia's prominence as a vaccine champion has waned. Currently, with a vaccination rate for COVID-19 of 56%, West Virginia ranks 36th in the nation for fully vaccinated adults. So what Amy and I tried to do was we wanted to try to identify the factors that are contributing to West Virginia's vaccine hesitancy. So our study analyzed whether any individual population characteristics like age, educational attainment, disability, access to insurance, if any of those socio-demographic characteristics are related to vaccine uptake. And also we wanted to look at the access to the internet. So yours was a beautiful introduction to our talk. So to contextualize this study, I'm going to give you some background regarding the coronavirus, vaccine distribution and deployment, governmental authority to intercede in matters of public health, and personal health literacy. Dr. Palumbo will then discuss the methods we use to address the research question as well as the results of our study. So COVID-19 comes from an acronym for Coronavirus Disease 2019. It's an acute respiratory disease caused by a coronavirus that is very similar to Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, and Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, or SARS. This new type of coronavirus, as we all know, was first detected in Wuhan City, China in December 2019, when a group of individuals presented with shortness of breath and fever. COVID-19 quickly spread across multiple countries, and by January 2020, the World Health Organization declared it to be a public health emergency of international concern. That was only the 6th time in its history that the WHO made such a recommendation. The first confirmed case of COVID-19 in West Virginia was on March 13th, 2020. As of January 27, 2020, 223 countries and territories have reported confirmed cases of COVID-19. The U.S. unfortunately leads the world in both the number of confirmed cases and the number of deaths associated with COVID-19. As of January 27, 2022, West Virginia has reported more than 429,000 cases of COVID-19 and 5,600 deaths. So vaccines offer protection against infection and mitigate the severity of illness by stimulating an individual's immune response against disease. In addition to individual protection, vaccines help to create herd immunity, which is also referred to as community immunity. Herd immunity is reached when a certain percentage of the population becomes immune to a disease either through vaccination or from infection. For example, the percentage of population that is required to be vaccinated or immune from disease before the threshold is met is dependent upon how contagious the disease is. So for example, measles is a very, very contagious disease. Herd immunity is met when about 95% of the population is immunized. The immunity threshold for polio is about 80%. Herd immunity is important because when attained, the further spread of the disease is significantly more unlikely. Herd immunity also protects our most vulnerable populations, the elderly, babies who can't get vaccinated, and individuals who are immunocompromised. As of February 2, 2022, there have been 5 variants of the COVID-19 disease. As the number of variants increases, so do more contagious strands of the disease, and it increases the percentage of the population that must be immunized before herd immunity is reached. Some experts are estimating that it will take about 85% of the population to be immunized before herd immunity is reached for COVID-19. Most vaccinations come from naturally occurring germs, either germs that are alive but attenuated, meaning it's a weakened form, or that are killed forms of the disease, or even toxins. The 2 vaccines that are most prominent for COVID-19, those manufactured by Pfizer and Moderna, use a very different process. These are called messenger RNA vaccines. Unlike those vaccines that are created from germs found in nature, mRNA vaccines use laboratory-created processes to teach cells how to make proteins to trigger immune responses. The usual process for vaccine approval takes between 10 and 15 years. This slide shows the typical steps that a vaccine manufacturer needs to go through before obtaining FDA approval. During extraordinary circumstances, however, the process can be significantly shortened. Yep. There we go. The Project BioShield Act of 2004 gave authority to the FDA to issue emergency use authorizations, or EAUs. An EAU allows for an unapproved vaccine, such as the Pfizer and Moderna, to be released before going through the lengthy process, or it allows for an unapproved use of an already approved medical product. Certain criteria, though, must be met before an EAU is issued. First, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Services, or the Secretary of the Department of Defense must confirm that an emergency exists. Secondly, an emergency declaration must be issued. Third, the FDA must make a determination that there is an agent that is causing a life-threatening situation, that it is reasonable to believe that the unauthorized product may be effective against such an agent, that the potential benefits of the unapproved product outweighs the potential risks, and the FDA must make a determination that there's really no reasonable alternative but to use the unapproved product. EAUs were issued for both Pfizer and Moderna in December of 2020. We all know that vaccines are not always safe. As a matter of fact, 44% of West Virginians who have not gotten the COVID-19 vaccine indicate that they are vaccine hesitant because of the potential side effects from getting the vaccine. The CDC and the FDA maintain a database to investigate the most serious vaccine side effects. The adverse side effects from either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine have been extremely rare, but they have been confirmed. Anaphylaxis, which is a severe allergic reaction that can be life-threatening, has been confirmed in about 0.0005% of the population, which translates to 5 people per million who have received the vaccine. This vaccine adverse event reporting system also has received about 2,200 complaints or reports of myocarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart muscle, and pericarditis, which is an inflammation of the sac surrounding the heart in people under the age of 30. But as of February 9, 2022, no cases have been confirmed. So I teach public health law at Temple, formerly at the University of Pittsburgh. And what public health law is it's the government's legal power and duty to assure conditions for people to be healthy and limitations on the state's power to constrain individual liberties. The origins of public health law can be found in the Bible. Actually, in the Torah, which is the first three, it's the third book of the Torah, the book of Leviticus in the Bible's Old Testament. In Leviticus, Moses describes sanitary laws and practices surrounding food safety, hazardous environmental conditions, and isolation and quarantine. Virtually every public health law is an infringement on your constitutional rights. So when students used to ask me why they should take my class, I would tell them it will help prepare you for the bar exam. Because it's all con law, except with a really interesting lens. So therefore, there's this constant conflict between individual rights and the state's right to do what's good for society. And we have seen this play out to the nth degree during this pandemic. So as in all other legal areas, at the federal level, authority for Congress to intercede in matters of public health comes from the U.S. Constitution. There is no explicit authority in the U.S. Constitution that says federal government, you can legislate matters of public health. We know they do it, so where did they find it? They find implicit authority in 2 clauses. 2 main clauses. 1, the Commerce Clause, which allows the federal government to regulate commerce between states, between the United States and foreign governments, and among tribal nations. So stuff like food safety laws, vaccination laws, and environmental protections all fall within the government's power to regulate commerce. The General Welfare Clause is the clause in the Constitution that allows Congress to tax and spend. So, taxing power not only provides funding for public health services, but it allows the government to encourage behaviors that it likes, like giving a tax break for buying insurance, and it allows the government to punish behaviors it dismisses, like taxing alcohol, firearms, and tobacco. Almost every executive branch agency at the federal level has plays some role in public health. But the primary federal agency that is tasked with ensuring the public's health is the U.S. Public Health Service. Have any of y'all ever seen anybody who works for the U.S. Public Health Service? Well, they actually wear uniforms, like they are in the military.
I think they're similar to Air Force.
Are they? They're similar to the Air Force uniforms. So the Public Health Service, along with the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid are all housed within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services has authority to relax certain regulatory provisions during emergencies. So after the president declares an emergency, either under the Stafford Act or under the National Emergencies Act, and the Secretary of Health declares a public health emergencies, they can invoke what is referred to as Section 1135 waivers. Section 1135 refers to a section of the Social Securities Act. So this authority was used by the Secretary after the pandemic hit to relax some telehealth regulations concerning what types of healthcare providers could be reimbursed by Medicaid for telehealth services. It also allowed for additional modalities to be used to deliver telehealth services. Waivers under 1135 also allowed physicians whose license had expired to keep practicing, and they also waived some requirements for new physicians who had not yet attained governmental authority to practice medicine, to practice before that was given. But besides the Department of Health and Human Services, a number of other federal agencies have taken steps to mitigate either the public health concerns from COVID or economic concerns associated with COVID. So for example, I think you probably remember that the IRS and the Department of Treasury extended the time period that we had to file our 2020 taxes. The United States Department of Agriculture took great measures to address food insecurity. So they used their National School Breakfast Program, their School Lunch Program, WIC, SNAP, which is their supplemental program that used to be known as food stamps, to address food insecurity issues that children were experiencing when they no longer had access to free lunch. The Department of Education has used its authority during this emergency to give grants to school districts that have been hit when their funders at the state level refuse to support universal health measures like mask mandates. So the federal government has stepped in to give them some funding. At the presidential level, both President Trump and President Biden have used their power through executive orders to address this issue. President Trump was criticized, but eventually used powers he had under the Defense Production Act to encourage manufacturers to manufacture things like PPE for healthcare providers. President Biden has enacted or has issued executive orders that relate to travel restrictions, et cetera. My notes are out of place. That's okay. 1 second. Okay. So although the federal government has played a very prominent role during the COVID pandemic, most public health matters are at the state level, or the state governments have delegated their authority down to local governments. So where do states find their powers to intercede in matters of public health? You got to look back at the U.S. Constitution. So under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, powers that are not expressly reserved for the feds by default fall to the states. There are also two doctrines that are really important in public health law and states' authority to intercede in matters of public health. The first is police power has nothing to do with law enforcement. Police power is the power of the state to enact regulations or to enact statutes and promulgate regulations that pertain to the safety, health, welfare, and morals of its citizens. In addition, parens patriae, do I have any Latin speakers? Does anybody want to take a guess at what parens patriae means? Parent of the? Great, parent of the country or parent of the fatherland. So that is the duty of state and local governments to step in and take affirmative actions on behalf of its citizens. So for example, if a person is incapacitated in some way, or children, the state has the duty to step in to protect its citizens. Jamie, I hope you don't mind that I used your vaccine mandate card. I was going to use my own, but it was upside down, and I couldn't figure out how to turn it right side up on the slide. So thank you. One of the most controversial initiatives introduced during the coronavirus pandemic was the thought of vaccine mandates. And even though this strategy has been met with a lot of divisiveness, it's not novel. In 1905, the Case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts, has anybody read that case? It's like the quintessential public health law case. It's been cited over 69 times by other cases. This case involved, the Supreme Court was considering the constitutionality of a smallpox vaccine mandate that was promulgated in Massachusetts by its Board of Health. There had been a smallpox outbreak in the area, and every adult and every child had to have a vaccine or be fined. And if people refused to pay the fine, they were imprisoned. Mr. Jacobson was a pastor from Sweden, and he refused to be vaccinated because he claimed that he had poor health outcomes as a result of vaccines he had had as a child. So he challenged the Board of Health's authority to institute such a mandate. Subject to certain limitations, the Supreme Court said definitively that it's within a state's police power to take public health actions such as vaccine mandates to protect its citizens. States have adopted 3 different types of exceptions or exemptions to vaccine mandates: medical, religious, and philosophical. And there's tremendous interjurisdictional variance with respect to what has to be proven to get one of these exceptions, who makes the decision as to whether your exception should be granted or not, et cetera. So West Virginia, California, Connecticut, Maine, Mississippi, and New York are the only states that do not allow religious or philosophical exemptions for children's vaccine mandates or requirements. They're not mandates, they're requirements. In a move, though, to thwart any potential vaccine mandate with respect to COVID-19, West Virginia enacted House Bill 335. So now in West Virginia, if you're an adult and your employer requires you to get a vaccine for COVID-19, you now have a religious exemption in addition to the medical exemption. To get a medical exemption in West Virginia is a protracted experience. You have to get statements from your physician. They have to say exactly what the potential poor health outcome is. They have to state if it's temporary or permanent. However, to get the religious exemption for adults for the COVID-19, any COVID-19 mandate, all that is required is a notarized statement that it's against your religious beliefs. Which leads me into the final topic I will be discussing, and that is personal health literacy. So when we were looking at this issue, it occurred to us that, why are people not getting the vaccine? Do they have access to information? And if they do have access to information, do they understand what information is being presented to them? And it's only when those 2 goals are attained that people have personal health literacy. They can use the knowledge that they get for healthcare decision making. Low personal health literacy has been tied, it's considered to be a risk factor, and it's actually been tied to lower health or poor health outcomes. Cost efficiency is also impacted by low personal health literacy, because people with low personal health literacy tend to use emergency departments as primary care facilities. They're less likely to take preventive measures to protect their health. Therefore, it is much more expensive for the rest of the community. Social determinants of health are conditions and places where people live, learn, work, and play that affect health outcomes. So social determinants of health that have been proven to impact personal health literacy are educational attainment, age, poverty level, disability, and the built environment. The built environment is defined as buildings and spaces and products that are built by people, such as the internet. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, to discuss how we examined this issue.
Thank you. Oh, does that work? Can people hear me? Great. Okay. So yes, so we want to take this, all of that information, that we know is important for personal health literacy, and understand what that means, at a broad level. We want to kind of take a step back and look at a county level. And again, this is important because, we are talking about herd immunity, right? So sometimes it makes sense to look at things at a higher level when these outcomes are important, not just for individuals. We know that vaccines protect individuals, but they also protect entire communities. So we are going to look at the data at a county level, because that's also the data that we had available. We did what was called an ecological study, or we used an ecological study design, and I will try to not bore people with too many statistics in this. I know you're not my typical audience, but the idea of an ecological analysis is just that you are, I thought these maps, kind of helped explain what we're doing. If you were to, kind of visually overlay the maps, we want to see, like, is, let's say, an increase in access to broadband internet associated with an increase in vaccination at the county level, for example. And that was one of our main exposures that we wanted to look at, was this idea of access to the internet. And we'll talk about some other things that we looked at as well. So, of course, the main thing we're interested in is vaccination rate. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we used. So vaccination rates, we calculated them, or we got the data as number of fully vaccinated people per 1,000 residents. So we had to make decisions about, how are we defining vaccinated? So we counted fully vaccinated, right? So either 1 dose of the Johnson & Johnson or 2 doses of Moderna. This was kind of pre-booster, so we're just ignoring booster shots for now. And then, of course, percent of the population with broadband internet access. And we, alluded to in the last talk, and hopefully we can have a discussion afterwards about the implications for broadband internet access and what that means. And we'll talk about the variability in broadband internet access as well. We also were interested in a number of, demographic or socio-demographic variables, right? So because we know that education is important for literacy, we wanted to look at a county level, what does education look like? What percentage of our population are high school graduates, or what percent have a bachelor's degree or higher? We are also interested in how poverty impacted these vaccination rates, or were associated rather with these vaccination rates. So the percent of the population below the federal poverty line. We are interested in how, the non-white population can be a signal of diversity in a community, and can kind of indicate factors that are related to kind of community. In this case, we're talking about whole counties, so county level characteristics, but kind of community atmosphere, and how much diversity there is in this case a county. We also know that age is important for health literacy in general, but also, of course, when it comes to decisions about whether to get the COVID-19 vaccine. We know that adverse outcomes from COVID infection are very different by age, and so we wanted to see how much differences in the age distribution across counties might account for some of these different vaccination rates. Same idea for percent of the population who have disability. I accidentally left off this list percent uninsured, but of course insurance is another thing, and I actually have some results looking at insurance, but percent who lack insurance, because that's an important, obviously, factor when it comes to being able to afford healthcare, or just being able to access a regular care provider. We also thought that the COVID-19 case and death rates might be important factors that might influence decisions on whether somebody gets vaccinated. If you are, if you personally know people who have died of COVID-19, theoretically that might impact your decisions. and then population density also, because we know from what we've learned throughout this pandemic that, the density in which we live can actually impact our risk of catching COVID-19. So does that also impact people's decisions on vaccination? I will note that, especially we're talking about, as we talk about healthcare access and telemedicine, we did try to also get information on healthcare access because we know that especially some of the rural counties, where are people going to physically go and get vaccinated? And we tried to find this data through some sources, but it actually was very hard to find. So that's a little preview of a limitation we have. So, to talk about the results, I'm going to try to move quickly here. So this is, we see wildly different rates of vaccination across the counties in West Virginia. So overall, if we take the whole state together, we have 435 fully vaccinated adults per 1,000 population. So that's less than half, right? Less than half of the adult population as of, this was actually back in end of September that we pulled this, but rates had pretty much plateaued by then, so they might be a little bit higher now, but probably not too much, too different. And then, so we see that in Mingo County in the southwest of the state, we saw our lowest rates of 258 per 1,000, or really, kind of around a quarter of the population fully vaccinated. And then a high of really just over 55% of the vaccination, of the population vaccinated in some of our higher vaccinated counties. So what do we do with this? So when we look at, and I'm sorry for the statistics, so we're talking about, all of this data is continuous, and so we want to we're looking at correlations. So is there a relationship, a linear relationship between these continuous data points? So our county level vaccination and some of our factors of interest. And I'm highlighting here on this slide just some ones that I want to talk about. And then we also, just to preview the methods, we also did what we call linear regression that looks at these relationships while accounting for other factors. So what we look for in these graphs is, so we look for a correlation coefficient and statistical significance. So just at the kind of really what we call bivariate level, we see that broadband internet access was associated with vaccination rate. And so this is, don't take these lines as as the actual results, but this is a general regression line. So this is kind of the association that we see. So with increased access to broadband internet, counties had, in general, higher vaccination rates. And of course, there's variability around all of these. There's a lot of reasons for this, but this is what we see. And this was one of the stronger relationships, right? So this P less than 0.01 means there's a less than 0.01% chance that this is just random. And we see a slightly attenuated relationship between high school percent of the population who's high school graduates and vaccination. A strong relationship, or moderate to strong, with having a bachelor degree, and a kind of weak inverse relationship with poverty. And so we looked at, and then also not shown on this graph is uninsured. So I showed these because really none of the other factors were associated with vaccination, which was a little bit surprising to us. It was really internet access and education. Those were the most important things at the county level. I'm just showing population density was somewhat independently related, but we'll show once we account for internet access and education, population density no longer becomes important. So, because all of those factors that were kind of independent when we just looked at them alone, so now we have to think, well, if we account for education, is is population density, for example, still important? And it wasn't. So the only things that remained were broadband internet access, and in this case, high school and bachelor's degree are highly correlated with each other, so they're going to be strongly related. And so bachelor's, having the percent of the population with a bachelor's degree was the stronger variable that was related. And so what does this mean? So these estimates mean that, with each, let me just make sure I have this interpretation right. So with each increase in a percent of the population, so each percent increase in a proportion with broadband internet access, there is one additional vaccine per 1,000 people, and for every percent increase in college degree, there are 3. So these are small, but they're indicative. At the population level, it's hard to change. It's hard to do interventions on individuals. So what can we think about, at a high level, a county level, at our neighborhood or community level? I'm trying to stay on time. So, just to note that there are limitations in our interpretation of this data. There's a lot of variability. I mentioned that. There's a lot of variability in the data. And probably, I mentioned that we couldn't account for, actual access to pharmacies or other healthcare facilities. And there are likely other factors that we couldn't account for. This is just correlation. And there's a, saying in public health and epidemiology that correlation does not equal causation. So we're not saying that these are necessarily causal, but there's an association that's worth looking into further. Also keep in mind, we are looking at aggregate levels. So this doesn't mean necessarily that the individuals who got vaccinated were the individuals, with more education or with the actual broadband internet access, but it's suggestive at the county level. So, do you want to join me for conclusions?
Yeah. So the bottom line is, did you click to the next slide? The bottom line is COVID-19 morbidity and mortality statistics do not favor West Virginians. Unvaccinated adults aged 18 and older are 4 times more likely to get COVID-19 and are 15 times more likely to die from coronavirus than adults who are vaccinated. Also, people with underlying medical conditions, chronic health conditions, are more likely to become severely ill from COVID. And unfortunately, West Virginia ranks 48th in the nation for health outcomes. Lack of trust in COVID-19 vaccines and the government are the 2 primary reasons West Virginians say that they have not gotten vaccinated. But we need to do more research to find out why. Why are they holding these beliefs? Information concerning vaccination sites and events in West Virginia are found on the West Virginia Department of Health's website. Has a gazillion different pieces of information on it, but you can't access it if you can't access the internet. And although West Virginia leaders claim that it's improving internet access is a priority, in fact, it's actually getting worse in the Mountain State. Nearly 66% of the world's population has internet, but only about 39.3% of West Virginians have affordable broadband internet that multiple people in a family can be accessing at the same time. So the bottom line is more research needs to be done to explain the why behind what we have found. We found very preliminary data explaining this much of vaccine hesitancy in West Virginia. And we look forward to hopefully expanding our research and conducting more qualitative analyses into the why. So that's it.
Okay, awesome. We still have time for questions or if anyone has any. I can run the microphone to you.
So much, thank you for the presentation. So much misinformation
Well, that's part of what we want to do a qualitative analysis of, right? Because we know what percentage of West Virginians have access to the internet, but we don't know what they're accessing, number one. And number two, we don't know if they understand the information that's being given. So when you look at the number of websites that have increased in terms of usage during the pandemic, most of them are national news organizations like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and local stations as well on the internet. Also governmental websites, the CDC and Johns Hopkins. COVID-19 trackers went through the roof during the pandemic. Something like 98% of Americans, that could be a little high, it might be more like 90% of Americans said that using the internet was critical to them during the pandemic. First time in history that that's happened. So we need to explore the what are they doing, why are they doing it, and where are they getting information from.
And I think it would be interesting to also explore, given limitations of internet access, what other than what informal social networks, formal or informal, are also kind of spreading information, and because then once the information kind of gets in that network, then that's going to take over, and we can't measure that with the data we have, but that's another interesting piece that I think we would need to look at.
I believe we have time for one more. Go ahead.
So I think as you were talking about the religious exemption, and I sense some skepticism of that, and I kind of add it from the human rights and sort of constitutional perspective. And generally, we don't want government sort of digging into people's doctrine and determining whether something is the doctrine of a church, or even probing too hard into sincerity because of the concerns over both separation of church and state and human rights. So I'm wondering what you would propose, or what you would see as the ideal approach for that exemption.
So when you look at the cases that have discussed religious exemptions and what is excessive governmental entanglement in granting them, there's a case in Arkansas called McCarthy versus Bozeman. And in Arkansas, to get a religious exemption, you had to get a notarized statement from organized religion, that you belonged to that church, that the church held those beliefs, that you attended that church. And the court kind of quipped, said they asked you for everything except your pew number. That Arkansas exemption was held to be unconstitutional under the Lemon test and under the Larson test because of the entanglement, excessive entanglement. And the health department was tasked with deciding whether to give a religious exemption. If you look at the challenges in New York, for example, in order to withstand constitutional scrutiny for a religious exemption, the courts generally look to whether the belief is religious as opposed to a philosophical belief. I just don't like vaccines, or I think vaccines might hurt my kid. Those are not religious exemptions. Saying that it's against my spiritual belief would be a religious belief. And the second thing they look at is whether it's sincerely held. And that is a little more nuanced or problematic to determine, right? It's kind of easy to look at someone's statement and decide if it's religious or philosophical or just a moral statement. But those seem to be the criteria the courts are using. And there's no requirement that a state even offer a religious exemption. And as I noted, about 8 states don't, except in West Virginia for COVID-19.
From an epidemiologic perspective, I will just put in my 2 cents that I think we also need to always consider, in addition to the law, the actual threat to the public. There are threats to, everybody if healthcare resources get overrun. And, of course, to individuals, depending on their situation, we need to, kind of consider the severity of the disease that we're talking about. We need to constantly kind of be evaluating that over time, because we know even just within these 2 years, things have changed. So I think, we need to always kind of keep that in mind when we are, thinking about the benefits and drawbacks of various mandates.
And as we conclude, I just want to give a shout out to my former student, Taylor Robinson from the University of Pittsburgh, who was kind enough to do all those maps for us.
Yes, I was supposed to do that. Sorry, sorry, Taylor.
Well, another round of applause for Professor Van Hoffman. And we'll now have lunch in the event hall that we had breakfast stuff in earlier. It should be organized by last name. If the law review members would please be nice enough to let the presenters grab their box lunch first. It would be great